Hi, I'm very happy to be with everybody here today, even though we're not in person. I was excited when they gave me the opportunity to talk about Latinos and working with Latino culture. I hope that you will find this presentation um, sort of like a teaser that will encourage you to actually go beyond it and really do some more research and working in a cross-cultural settings. I can't hope really in a little bit over an hour to really cover the subject in a meaningful way, but I hope it'll at least give you a taste for the enjoyment of working within other cultures, especially the Latino culture, give you some ideas, some practical solutions to how to engage clients who are Latino and their children. And I guess I should start by telling you a little bit about myself. You might notice with my appearance and a surname of Olson, which is strongly suggests Nordic Viking ancestry, that it's probably I'm an unlikely character to be connected to the Latino culture. So I want to tell you a little bit about my history so you understand where I'm coming from and understand a little bit about why this subject is so important to me. So I was born and raised in the country of Argentina and actually did not come to this country to live permanently till I came for college. And I lived in Argentina. I also lived in Ecuador for 2 years and the country of Bolivia for 1 year. And so I had the opportunity to intersect a variety of South American cultures and to be formed by them. Uh, in many ways, as far as immigrant child's experience here in this country, I had sort of like a reverse life experience than they did in the sense that my parents were from this country. So we spoke English at home mostly. But my schooling was in Spanish. My friends were all Argentine. And so I grew up actually in both worlds. I was a third culture kid. And I'll explain a little bit about the concept of third culture in a little bit or later on in the presentation. But anyway, that is why this subject has been dear to my heart. When I came to this country, naturally, I integrated my understanding of Latino culture in all the things that I did. So when I did an undergraduate degree in psychology, and then went on and got my master's in social work, and in both of those settings, I focused quite a bit on intercultural treatment and development. And I had the opportunity to, in my job, because I spoke Spanish, naturally, they would assign me and give me any of the clients that were Latino or Spanish origin. And so over the last 25 years, basically, a great focus of my work with people has been with people who are recent immigrants to this country. I've worked in the school system at Fayette County for almost 15 years now. And some of those years as a family resource center person, and some of those years as a social worker. And in all cases, I was in schools which had a high Latino population. So naturally, I just kept working with the population, kept enjoying them even further. And so that's what I'd like to share with you today. Let me try to share my screen and I can start on the presentation. And let's see, let's go to slideshow. Okay. So what I hope to do in this presentation is really help with the understanding of Latino immigrants, especially working with them in a school setting and with their children. There is at the front of the slideshow, you see that's my contact information, my email address. I'm part of the school. If you don't have an opportunity to get all your questions answered at the end of the session, or this is a session that doesn't offer the live exchange at the end of it, please feel free to email me. At the end of the slide presentation, I'll show the slide again so you get a chance to write down my email address. So again, I'm going to emphasize the importance of knowing the Latino populations you serve. I want to specifically focus this presentation on understanding how different cultural values from the Latino perspective and our US or dominant white US culture interact, and talk about cultural barriers that it causes. And then also I want to hopefully offer some practical ways to reach out to Latino kids and work with their families. So why does it matter? One of the things we have to understand is that the Latino immigrant is becoming a larger and larger portion of this population of this country. There were recent estimates are about 16.7 million Latino households in this country. And if you look at the school population, because the population tends to be a more youthful or younger population, close to 23% people enrolled in schools are of Latino descent. Not all, of course, recent immigrants. And in Kentucky, you see, we have at least 6,000 children of Mexican immigrants in our schools. And of course, children of other nationalities and immigrants also. So in Kentucky, what it looks like is we have about 19% of the immigrants in our population are directly from Mexico. You also see that we actually have pretty high immigrant patterns from India, from Cuba, and from China, Guatemala. And more recently, I think the numbers are going up quite a bit higher on Honduran too. A lot of our recent immigrants are Honduran. If you look at our population as a whole, this is a graph from the Pew Research Center that you can, if you look at it, you can tell that from 1970, the population has steadily grown. 1970, we're just under 10 million. And in 2019, we're at 60 million Hispanic population. Some states, like in California, have actually have recently crossed the barrier where the majority of the population, by a slim margin, is of Latino descent. Like I said, so like there's 61 million Latinos in the United States as of 2019. They're about 18% of this nation's total population. And the other thing to think about is that overall, our population in the last, well, actually, from 2002 to 2017, 2016, 2017, the US population has increased by 2.2 million, but Latinos account for 1.5 million, or about half of that total growth. So as our population grows and continues to grow, what you're seeing is there's a preponderance of Latino gaining in that overall growth of the country. Quite frankly, it's mostly due to, it's a lot less due to immigration, a lot more due to birth patterns. Latino families tend to have more children than Caucasian or other groups within this country. So if you look at that growth rate, if you look at what the projections are, and this is from the United Census numbers, you really can see that in 2017, for example, they're about 18% of our population, but the projections are by 2060, they're going to be 28% of the population. And actually, when I looked at some new numbers that are temporary still, because of this last census is so new, they haven't gotten the numbers up completely yet, 9% by 2060, looking at the new data. One thing I'd like to take a chance to point out is, you see on the slide, it's about largest Latino ethnic group states. It does not say immigrant groups, partly because Puerto Rico's on it. And I want to remind everybody, and this lots of times people don't really recognized, but Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States, and its citizens are citizens of the United States. They're no more of an immigrant to Kentucky than I, having come from Chicago, am an immigrant to Kentucky. They are Americans. And so there are lots of times when you look at numbers and statistics, they put Puerto Ricans because of their ethnic background in the same group. But I just want to be clear about that and remind people about that. One thing I need to talk about is the unauthorized immigration, or those that have come into the country without papers. I don't want to go down any political rabbit trails, but it's important to, there's special needs that arise for our immigrant folk who have come over and are not papered. If you look at the total number of unauthorized immigrants in the country, you can see that about 1/4 of them actually are unauthorized immigrants, because 35 million and about 77% of them are actually naturalized citizens. Immigrants, they are full citizens of this country. There's another large number, another 27% are permanent residents. They have green cards, they're free to work here. And then we also have temporary lawful residents. Those are people that are coming over on work visas, for example. So when you look at the total number, about 10 million, or about 23% of the immigrants in this country actually are not papered. Of course, this is research done by the Pew Center. It is difficult to get accurate numbers on any of this due to the nature of not having paper trails. If you look at basically what's happened in the unauthorized immigration in this country over the last years, if you look from the 1990s to about 2008, you see a pretty steady increase that progresses each year. Right around 2008, there coincides with that Great Recession, the Obama administration. You see a plateauing of that and actually a lowering of the total number. So at this point, we are actually plateaued just under 10 million, or just a little bit over 10 million. Also, for the first time since 1990, immigrants from Mexico represented less than half of the undocumented population. And so Mexican undocumented population is about 4.95 million of the 10 million. So there's another 2 million from Central America, another 1.5 million from Asia. And the other thing to consider is that about 2/3 of all of the undocumented immigrants in these states has been here for 10 years or longer. And just only 20% have been here under the 5 years. So the other thing you see with illegal immigration is that shifted from border crossing to visa overstays. So at this point, 62% of all the undocumented immigrants in this country did not cross the southern border, did not cross the border at all. Rather, they came in through a port of entry. They flew in an airport and with a student visa, work visa, tourist visa, and simply overstayed that visa. If you look at arrests at the border, you see this is from 2008. That sort of also coincides with where you start seeing the plateau. Just if you look at that chart a little bit, you'll see that actually the Obama years were very high as far as arresting at border and deportations. We'll talk about that a little later too. Another slide shows you sort of the nature and makeup of deportations. They were slightly up in 2018. 2019, they went higher. But as you see, the real years of 2008 all the way up to 16 were pretty high numbers of both non-criminal and criminal individuals who were in the criminal system that were deported. It's interesting. Obama actually, I remember during his administration, many of the Latino folk that I worked with, we used to call him, his nickname was Deporter in Chief because of the increase in deportations that occurred under that administration. You can see ICE arrests were really high in early years, 2008, 9, around there, and then they precipitously sort of lowered until about 2016, and you've seen an uptick in ICE arrests. So we've spoken about the detentions and the apprehensions on the border. This slide, if you observe it, gives some newer information about what's happened in recent years. I have data from 2019, and you see that there has been a change. There's been a much larger, almost double the number of apprehensions at the border than in previous years. And you also notice that there's a change in the type of apprehensions that have occurred. So if you look at that last bar over there, it shows that 474,000 family units were apprehended and 76,000 unaccompanied minors, and then 302 single adult and 302,000 single adult. And I think one of the main reasons why there's been so many more family units taken at the border is simply because of the deterioration of Honduras and Guatemala as far as their political systems and the real danger that people are in those countries and their attempt to flee. Also, the narco traffic conflicts in Mexico have led to increased number of family units trying to seek asylum in getting out of their country and getting to safety. So that's one of the reasons. I think also it's fair to say that in the last years, deportations from ICE were done in a much more public fashion. It seemed it has greatly increased the fear of deportation among this population. And so when you're working with the immigrant population, one of the things you have to understand is that there is always this chronic underlying fear of being deported, losing status, separation from families. That's part of the trauma that you're working on with these people. Okay, so hopefully that'll give you a basic understanding of the data as far as the numbers of people, numbers of immigrants that are in the country and what their statuses are like. What I want to focus on now is basically understanding culture and understanding what we can do and how we can understand this group of people and provide treatment options that are culturally relevant, and also be able to engage and form relationships. And so let me just start with thinking about what culture is and what's meant by it. There's many definitions of culture. And we could have an entire presentation on just going through, because that's a very complex and meaning loaded word. But one working definition that I found very helpful that was done by Sue and Sue is this. This is culture equals the shared behaviors, beliefs, traditions, common history, and values or norms of a community of individuals. For the purposes of this presentation, what I have found very helpful is to use what's in red, the values and norms, as a way to look at culture through a lens in which it's easier to understand how it differs, how one culture differs from another. So for this presentation, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be taking what has been defined by anthropology, common values that are shared with Latino, in particular Mexican culture, and compare that and contrast that to the values, the key values that define the USA's dominant culture. And by dominant, I mean, each country has a variety, of influx of cultures that are competing and interwoven. But the dominant culture is that which the norms and values that are idealized by the culture. They're the types of values that are the types of values we attempt to teach in school. They're the types of values that we teach in church. They're the types of values that we feel makes a good citizen of whichever country you're in. So we'll go over that a little more details later. The other thing, and I like this slide, and I've seen it in a number of different presentations, but it's very, very helpful to understand. And when we are talking about culture, it's like this iceberg. And lots of times when people are talking about culture, we are talking about the foods, the crafts, the language, what people wear, the traditions, the parties, the festivals, those types of things that are on the surface that we can see. But the largest part of what defines a culture are these things that are unseen. They're underneath the water. They're the beliefs, the values, the time orientation, the expectations that people have of each other, their space orientation, learning styles, all these things that are integral to what sort of supports what you see on the outside. And this is why I very, very strongly, if there's one thing you can do to understand culture, is to purposefully place yourself in a position where you are immersed long enough in a culture where you actually start seeing these underlying things. Because the way culture works, and because so many of these things are underneath the surface, they're things that normally we don't question. So, for example, I'll throw out one ideal that we have very dominant in this culture is the idea of individualism, of individual success, of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, right? If you never get the opportunity to actually immerse yourself in another culture, it's really hard to see that as a value of your own because it's just accepted. It is considered the rule by which all people live under. And then when you actually experience other cultures at a deeper level, you start recognizing some of these biases that you may not even be aware of. That's why I really encourage people, if they have the opportunity, or if your children have the opportunity, to encourage them to do study abroad, Peace Corps, longer term mission type projects where they're immersed in a native culture. If our only experience of other countries is from like a cruise ship or a resort, or maybe like a real short-term mission trip, what happens is we see all the top things, all the observable elements of the culture, and we are actually so overwhelmed by the assault on our senses that's sort of takes over. That's all you can see. But you really never experience culture shock, and you never have those conflicts, internal conflicts, that force you to look at the deeper values, the deeper things. So just as a word of encouragement, if you ever get a chance to do something like that, please do it. If your children do, I know it's very scary, but it is an awesome experience for them. especially like student exchange programs, anything like that. So let's talk a little bit more about what I mean by values. Normative values are those values that are described as desired characteristics of a society, and they are determined by the dominant group within that society. They're like I said before, those are the characters that are typically taught in our institutions. They underpin the legal system of the society. And one of the key things I was trying to point out is that they're largely not challenged because they're seen as universal. We tend not even to see them as values. They are just the way life is. I need also to spend a little time with some disclaimers about what we're trying to cover today in talking about cultures. One thing, as in all things, sometimes a bit of knowledge can be pretty dangerous if we apply it incorrectly. So I want to have some disclaimers. I want to point out, first of all, that whenever we're talking about culture, it's a very broad brush. You're trying to look at an entire group of people. And of course, there are huge variations between individuals within the culture. In other words, so when you're looking and when you have some knowledge of, okay, these are some values that underpin a culture, you can't then turn around and place them on an individual and expect that that individual is going to follow them all. Because there are huge variations on how individuals interact. We'll talk about that more. Also regions and countries. I mean, think of terms of, we say we have a dominant culture with dominant values, American but think of, if you've had a chance to visit New York City or California, how different your experiences of how people interact and what their expectations and norms. So there's huge difference between variations. And especially when you're looking at South America and Central America, there are huge differences between the countries. And so when we speak about some of these values, you can't apply these values equally to all countries. Obviously, there's differences also between the urban and rural populations of each country. That's true in this country. There's a rural and urban divide. That's true in Latin American countries also. What's interesting, one of the reasons why in some ways in Kentucky it's easier to talk about these classical cultural values is because a lot of the immigration that comes to Kentucky is actually people who tend to be more in the rural setting or come from the rural settings of their countries of origin. That's because, quite frankly, a lot of the jobs and types of things that attract them to the state are agricultural. So you have a preponderance of individuals coming from South America or Mexico that have a rural background. So you're going to have much more classical or traditional values in those settings. Also, obviously, there's variations in class. The upper class is a very different set of standards than the lower classes in all cultures and all standards. They have different ability to be exposed to information. They have different experiences of life that changes their value system. And the other thing is culture is not static. It doesn't stay in one place. It's influenced by the needs of the time, and it's influenced by interactions with other cultures. So for example, when we're talking about immigrants, the very fact that an individual chose to leave their country of origin and come to this country means that their culture, their understanding of their culture is different than those that chose not to leave. And perhaps they're more open to the values of the culture that they're entering. Also, as they get here, as immigrants get here, and especially as their children interact with our culture, their culture is extremely influenced by the new culture. And so they no longer hold the same values and cultural expectations as they did when they first arrived. That is one reason why, if you speak to especially the children of immigrants who return for one reason or another to their parents' homeland, you find that they feel many times they describe feeling very disconnected, very ambivalent about their culture of origin, because they no longer, they have this influence of the second culture that's taken over. Now that I've had a chance to give some disclaimers and tales of caution in looking at culture and looking at values, anthropologists have basically defined 8 key values that they think encompasses a great deal of what can define the culture, our dominant culture in this country. This research has been done over many years. The counseling psychologist is where I acquired it. First of all, we have a strong sense of individualism, of the role of individuals and the value of individuals in society. We stress greatly personal freedom, personal liberties, sort of a rugged individualism that we can pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. Another value that when they looked at our culture, that we're highly competitive. We have a high value of competition. We also have a high value of being action-oriented. We tend to be very focused on solving problems and on doing things. Self-sufficiency, that also ties into individualism, but it's defined as giving a sense of that we as individuals are in control of our own fates. We can make decisions and choices that allow us to change the environment around us, allow us to either be successful or fail. So we have, in psych terms, an internal locus of control. We believe that we can control the factors in our lives. We tend to have a future orientation, tend to think a whole lot more about the future and future possibilities than we dwell on the past in history. We emphasize in our thinking emphasizes on the scientific model and using logic to determine reality, to determine truth. We have a propensity toward materialism. And what I mean by materialism is not simply the acquiring of things, but more our orientation is to the physical, the tactile things versus, for example, the spiritual. And we also have a very utilitarian or pragmatic worldview. The US has a strong sense of let's fix problems, let's solve problems. Now, if you look in contrast with the key Mexican and also shared by many Latino cultures, this research was done by Sue and Sue, or compiled. It's actually been done for many years. But one of the key values is familismo, which means a family-centered orientation. Relacionismo, which is more of a collectivism and also a connectivity to other people. Fatalismo, or fatalism. Espiritualismo, or spirituality. Simpatía, which is a word that defines having harmonious relationships with each other. Contentamiento, which is being contented, having a value of seeking contentment. Machismo, which is a male-focused dominance. And autoridad, and specifically they're talking about their comfort level with an established hierarchical authority. Now, what I'm going to do, I went through these very quickly. What I'm going to do is now try to do a compare and contrast of them to actually tease out and have some ideas of how to proceed in treatment. So let's first look at the familismo versus individualism. It has huge implications in a lot of different areas, but what we'll see is that the value placed is on the family unit versus as the individual, for success, for what you value. They also have, and Latino cultures have a much stronger sense of extended families and having friendship networks, a community sense of networks. Whereas if you look at what individualism does in contrast is we tend to have a higher value on individual success, on individual, also individual failure when we fail. Our society tends to be structured more closely to our nuclear families with some extended family involvement. And we tend to have looser social connections. It's interesting if you look at collectivism versus individualism on the worldwide scale, you'll see the dark purple is the highest individualistic countries, going down to the clear, which is very communitarian type of cultures. If you look at that at its face, you'll see that European and specifically English speaking and Northern European countries have a much more higher of the individual values. Whereas as you work your way down to the Southern hemispheres, you have more of a collectivistic view of the world. It's interesting because a lot of this research was done by individuals who actually took the anthropological structures, the theories of values, and these people wanted to market their products and advertise around the world. And when they were using their advertisements that they had been creating in this country and just trying to wholesale transfer them to other cultures, they discovered that their marketing was not working. The people were not buying their products. And so a great amount of research was done to really take these and try to measure around the world different levels of these collective values on different cultures. The USA actually is, out of 54 countries that were assessed, the USA actually was the number one as far as the stress on individualism and individual freedoms, just to give you a sense. So we're sort of an anomaly. So how does this affect, or what are some practical implications of this when working with families, working with children? One of the key things to think about is how we motivate people. If you're motivated by individual success, then having conversations with people or with children saying, if you work really hard in school, it'll give you an opportunity to go further in education. You'll eventually be able to get a really good job and you'll be able to take care of yourself. You might be able to get some really cool stuff. Okay, so all those values that are just talked are more targeted toward a society that has individualism as its key marker. But if you have a society that has family as its key marker, then what I've found is much more effective in working with Latino or immigrant children is talking about how their success as individuals in school impact their family. Wouldn't you want to be in a place someday in your life when you can take care of your mom and dad for all the time that they've put and energy they've put into taking care of you? That type of thing. It brings the motivation is more looking at the collective, or wouldn't it be nice, you're the oldest, wouldn't it be nice if you could actually help pay for your little brother's college education? If you get a really good job, you'll be able to do that. See, so I'm motivating it more at the collective level, more at the family. The other thing that's interesting is when in behavior situations, when I'm pulling a kid who's misbehaving, and it's more of a matter of not wanting to versus not knowing how. One of the things that you can use for motivation is touching on that family honor. So when I have a real serious situation, and I don't pull this out very often because it's a very heavy thing to say to a kid, but I'll say, oh, is what you're doing honoring your mom and your father right now? How does this honor your family? Would they be proud of you? Those types of motivations have a much stronger pull. The other practical thing that the implication of this is thinking about who the stakeholders are when you're working with people. Being aware that extended families are part of the equation of the nuclear family. Quite often you will find that teachers do a parent-teacher conference, and the parents that show up are the parents, one or two of the parents, abuelita, tío, uncle, auntie, cousin, and sometimes even families are created because if you're an immigrant to this country and you have a strong value of extended family and you've left all your extended family in your home country, then it is very natural that when you come here, the friends and relationships of your parents become adopted aunts and uncles. And quite often when talking to kids, they'll talk about their cousin, their uncle, and when you really explore it with them, you discover that, oh, this actually is not a blood relative, but they function as part of that extended family. They may be wanting to show up at the parent-teacher conference, even though they're not on the list of approved adults. So this is something to consider, is when you're working with a child, being able to understand that there's a lot of stakeholders, a lot of the family might be invested, and it can be very encouraging for teachers because they'll see a whole bunch of people show up. It can also be frustrating if it gets a little crazy. Another thing that you consider with this is family communication styles. Quite often I have found, especially in my Mexican cultural background people, and in Central American too largely, is that the communication within the family, not much is not shared with children, because you're looking at a family unit as a unit, which means adults often share information that people coming from sort of the US dominant culture would feel uncomfortable with, thinking that's not age appropriate. So for example, I'll have often children who can speak quite extensively about their parents' problems, their marital problems, infidelities. When the adults in the household are scared of deportation or something happening, the children are brought right into that conversation, creates a lot of anxiety for them. But you have to understand that if you're functioning where your unit of change is the family, then information is going to be shared at a larger level. And the whole sense of developmental stages and developmental readiness may not be a factor in making those decisions. The next big thing to think about or value is fatalism versus self-sufficiency. And fatalismo is a strong sense that what is coming in life to you, you do not have the levers of control to make a lot of change. It's an external locus of control. Things happen to us more than we can input things on our external environment, which is very contrasting to our sense as US values of internal locus of control, or whether you are able to manipulate and change your environment. This is found even in the language. If you think in Spanish, if I lose my keys, the most common way of expressing that in Spanish is my keys have become lost to me. It's reversed. It's almost in the sense that it's the keys' fault that they've disappeared, right? Whereas in English, the most common way of saying that is, I lost the keys. You are taking responsibility for it. There also, have you heard the expression, que será, será? What will be, sort of a mantra. That again touches on that fatalism. And you'll see that even in their fairy tales, and in the next slide, I'll show you some examples of this. Even the fairy tales that you tell, the folk tales that you tell your children, might have sad endings, or might have endings that demonstrate the lack of control. The American, or the US, I should say, value system, it's all about You have control of your situation. You're supposed to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. We have the American dream, or the desire to better ourselves. And we have the sense that we, with our own hard work, our training, our education, we can achieve that dream. And who is responsible in all this? We are. One of the interesting things, you see this even in the legal system in this country, and this is something that gave me quite a bit of culture shock actually when I got here. People are responsible for all kinds of things that they would not be considered responsible for in Latin America. For example, I remember the first time that I was looking on the news and a hurricane went through the South, and the reporter was talking immediately, like within 10 minutes of talking about the devastation, was talking about who's responsible for those levees that weren't built correctly. What was the responsibility of the people who gave the warnings? Was the early warning sufficient? All those things. And I was just scratching my head and thinking, yeah, but it was a hurricane. So it's an act of God. I mean, how and it took me a while to understand, well, that is driven, that whole who is responsible for things is driven by that sense of internal locus control. We have control over our environment. And the legal system in where I grew up, it's very rare to take somebody to civil court for liability. If somebody's fallen because there's ice on your sidewalk, or water, depending where you're living, it's not your fault that you happen to have a sidewalk that you own and somebody else fell on it. It's just the sidewalk's fault. It's just fate. That person just fell. And so the idea of suing for a lot of things just is not really part of the culture or the legal system. So the next slides are some pictures of some of the very common and fun children's stories that are very common in Latino culture. As a practical suggestion for engagement, one of the things that's really fun to do in a small group of kids who are Latino immigrant is to actually invite them in the group to tell you different stories, tell you different of their folk tales, and then use those to sort of generate a conversation of the values that those express. It's a lot of fun, or even around the lunch table, getting a group of kids to start talking about these stories or other stories that they have. You'll get a very entertaining and enjoyable session. La Llorona, first one I have depicted here, is a story that all children probably of Mexican or Latino descent will know if you bring it up. The basic essence of the story is a mother of children who has been jilted by her husband or a lover, is so distraught and destroyed by this experience that she ends up drowning her own children in the river. And the story goes on that even now the ghost of La Llorona wanders through the streets, wanders especially by bodies of water, and you can hear her wailing in the night. So that's an example of a story, a children's story. Another that is very popular is the chupacabra. And the chupacabra literally means the goat sucker. It is a common story. You can get some enjoyable stories of fear from kids when they tell you about this guy who runs through the desert and will kill your goats, but also kill you or suck your blood. And another third one that's really popular in a lot of South America is El Cucuy or El Cuco. This is basically their version of what we call the boogeyman. You'll see that he has one large ear. The reason why El Cuco has one large ear is because he can hear anything and see anything bad that you do. And so you've got to watch out for El Cuco, because he'll come, he'll get you, and he'll eat you if you're bad. And even if your mom and dad don't hear what you're saying or see what you're saying, you got to watch out for El Cuco. So those are some examples There's all kinds of uh, books that have English and Spanish versions of folk tales. If you look into those, it's a lot of fun to do groups and to work with kids, and it's a way to celebrate their culture and hear their stories and their perspective on things. So one of the things so those are just examples of how children's stories can be quite, they don't all end on a happy ending. And even if you think about it, if you think of our stories in the USA, the Grimm fairy tales and the fairy tales that were developed in the Middle Ages in Europe have been very much so Disneyfied. When you see, the tale of Cinderella or Little Red Riding Hood, and you'll see that we in our culture have chosen to give them happy endings. And we choose, for the most part, in our movies or TV productions, there's a specific pattern of crises that is resolved at the end. Usually things end on a high note, or at least on a resolved crisis. And if you spend much time watching foreign movies, quite often I hear from people, well, wait, that's the ending? That's how they chose to end it? Sometimes things end sort of on a just sort of nowhere, or sometimes they end in a very negative, they leave a negative feeling. And that's very common for Latino culture, or Latino productions, movies, TV shows. The other thing, if you think about it from a clinical perspective, one thing fatalism does in a culture is it adjusts your thinking about poverty and your poverty. If you grow up in a culture that's very fatalistic, if you happen to be poor, it's very much attributed to your circumstances, your fate. You were born into a certain caste. You were born to be poor. There is a lot less maybe emotional judgment of self-blame or blaming the person who is poor, just because as a fatalistic society, you see poverty as something that cannot necessarily be cured, and it's not really the fault of those who are poor. In an individualistic society, look at the cycles of poverty and a lot of research on it. There's often this burden of shame that is associated with poverty. People who are poor who feel that they did not work hard enough, or people put that on them that they did not work hard enough or have the opportunities. So that it changes the nature of how that cycle of poverty works. Another thing fatalism will obviously affects is implications for self-directed change. If you truly are raised in a culture that believes that your ability to control your circumstances is limited, then the approach we have to take in helping people in understanding their situation and trying to come alongside of them as they're finding solutions and trying to change is an understanding that a lot of that self-directed things like self-talk, the sort of challenging cognitive narratives, that type of thing, may not work as well in a culture that really does not believe that they have much impetus in change. One of the things I say is, as a social worker, it's the whole idea of using systems-based approach makes a lot of sense when you're working with a culture that has strong senses of fate. You're working and mapping out their ecosystems, their means, what the inputs that they have from the outside. It's also helpful in echo mapping, just because we talked about familismo, the value of family, the value of extended family. It really enables you to have a good dialogue with people about what resources are out there, and then what barriers are out there and how to address them as a society, as a system. The next sort of value system I want to contrast is relacionismo versus action orientation. So one of the easiest ways to describe this is In the United States, when you go to a cocktail party, a Christmas party, whatever, and you're meeting a stranger, somebody who wants to get to know you, what is one of the very first questions they ask? They ask, what do you do? What do you do? Where do you work? And so to define a person, that's the first level of questioning that you ask, because that's one of our highest values as a society. Now, if you go to the same type of event or party, and it's in Spanish, it's a Latino-based party, most often the very first questions you get are about, who are you connected to? Who is your family? Who are your relationships? What part of society do you fit into? So those are the things that people are most curious about on the front end of a conversation. And what you do for a livelihood many times is way down on the list as far as before people actually are curious and ask you about that. They have a much stronger relacionismo. You spend your effort, your energy in building relationships. That is where most of your identity is based. Your sense of self-fulfillment, your sense of purpose is in relationships. In an individualistic society that's very action-oriented, a lot of our personal identity, what makes us feel accomplished, connected, fulfilled, is what we do for our career, what we do at work. In this country, if I'm walking down the hall and somebody asks me what I'm doing, it's very important to let everybody know I'm exhausted and very busy, because we're action oriented. That's if somebody asks me, oh, how's work going for you, and you say, oh, I've had for a little easier day today. It's not been. No, we want to impress upon each other just how horribly busy we are, and that fits that value. It's because our self-esteem is connected to success. It's connected to our productivity. Self-esteem in a relationship-based society is more connected to the relationships, if that makes sense. Another difference in our societies or cultures is spirituality versus science. You'll find Latinos tend to have a very religious side of them. And the religiousness has a mystical quality to it. They tend to be attracted to things that are more ritualistic, have rituals, or the old mainline denominations, and experiential experiences that they have. We also, the United States was rated as highly religious with the one group that was doing research on the level. But it's interesting, the type of Christianity, and I'll speak to Christianity because that's what I know most about, here tends to have gravitated more to the Protestant evangelical model. And one thing that's interesting about that is in that model of faith, it's very important about how you think about things. What is your theology? Do you have correct thinking? And it stresses a little less the experiential parts of it, the mystical parts of the faith. It's very education focused. The most important part of most services is the actual sermon or the educational portion of it. Whereas in most expressions of the Roman Catholicism and other faiths that are stronger in South America, it's more, the homily or the preaching is less long, and they're much more focused on the taking of the sacraments, the rituals that they're experiencing. Also in Latino culture, a lot of information is gained by folk tales, legends, oral history. Those, as a practical matter, using those types of connecting points with Latino families can be very, very helpful. They also use science, but they value at sometimes the same level, the scientific method over folk tales. So I mean, when I worked with Latinos and when I was working in kidney and liver transplant in Chicago, one of the things that I often found is that the patients would consult and attempt to follow their doctor's orders, but they would also consult and follow recommendations and orders from the local curandero or witch doctor in their community. And they measured these science, and they sort of balanced those two elements of in trying to make decisions about their health. Um, Another big difference or value thing that you could look at is the whole sense of simpatía, or the relationship, having relationships that are harmonious versus efficiency and productivity that occurs in more of our USA-based culture. A good example of this, I'll give you an example from my father's life. As a missionary in Argentina, he was allowed to, about once every 8 years, get a new car. And so we had returned from the United States. He had got his brand new car, and he was working with the elder in a church, or meeting with the elder in a church, and I was there with him. I was a young boy at that time, but this image always I remembered. He was working with a Quechua group of people, so they are Argentine, but they have very strong influences from an indigenous background, and they, even more so than the average Argentine, have a strong sense of needing to have harmonious relationships. And so, anyway, my father I got this brand new car. He is American through and through. He loves his vehicle. It is a status symbol for him. And he's at this meeting, and the elder's child starts crawling all over the car. And I already see my dad's face getting a little red. Then the child actually gets up on the car, on the windshield wiper, and starts literally bending the windshield wiper with his hands. And at this point, I see my dad's forehead, the little vein on his head throbbing. But he knows he cannot get angry about this, and he cannot direct the child to stop doing what he's doing, because it would ruin, in his terminology, his witness or his ability to connect and relate to this man. And the father who watches his son doing this has no sense that this is a problem, has no sense that this is distressful to my father. But to my father, it's very distressful. So that's an example of how, when you're meeting culture and you're clashing, you're trying to work within another culture, how your own values have to be you have to really guard against your own values if you want to maintain a harmonious relationship. Typically, too, one thing that this can indicate is there's a conflicts avoidance. You want a harmonious relationship. Often when I'm working with a Latino family and I have developed a great treatment plan idea, we've got the objectives thought through, we have a plan, we want to do this, the family will sit there with me, talk it through, they're all on board, they say, yes, 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 this is what we're going to do. Ask them a week later, and the plan is gone. It hasn't ever been implemented. There's it's even lost. They can't find it. And that's part of the whole conflict avoidance, is that if a person really doesn't want to do what you're suggesting or working with you in a certain area, they may to your face say, yes, 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 I will do it. But they don't necessarily have any intent on completing it, because they're avoiding that interpersonal conflict. The other thing that is really key is the value of warmth in your relationship with Latino folks. A warmth in your demeanor. I notice that when I speak Spanish, even my voice tends to become warmer, softer, tends to speak at a lower level, because warmth is so highly valued. And when you speak that way, you get reflected back to you acceptance. I have experience. One principal of mine knows just a schmidget of Spanish, but he is the warmest person, and he will go up to a Latino family and just slaughter Spanish with them. Uh, but they laugh, they love it, they feel connected to him, and because he's not only is he showing that he values their culture and their language, but he's willing to be real with them, to be warm with them. So warmth goes a whole long, I mean, it goes a long distance with this population. It does so in all of our relationships, correct? But with a Latino, it has a special place in them. The next slide is authority established versus authority earned. There is more a sense in Latino cultures, and if you think about fatalism, this may connect to it a bit, is that authority is destined to be in place, and authority might be questioned rarely, especially to its face. Whereas in our culture, we have a tendency to focus more on the right of the authority. Has this person earned the authority to have a conversation with me? And the questioning of authority is considered healthy. And whereas in the classic Latino culture, it isn't. And so what ends up happening quite often is that when authority structures are changed, authority is not challenged until it gets so egregious that the people rise up and create a new authority structure. I think that speaks to a great deal of why in many Latin American countries there's such a volatility in the politics, and a lot of political organizing, a lot of revolutions, a lot of extreme change is partly because authority is given a lot of power until it is no longer serving the populace, and then there is a large change to that structure. And machismo versus less machismo. What I mean by that is, remember when I talked about the rating scale of different cultures and their levels of exemplifying these values. Hofstede was that group I told you about that went around and rated cultures to figure out how to market their advertising to. And they give, like Mexico has a rating of 6, whereas the US has a rating of 15. That's on a rate of 1 to 50. So the United States still has a much more male-dominated culture than many societies, but the Mexican culture in specific is even higher. A very strong hierarchical family authority structure, and males are socialized for dominance over females and socialized for independence, or females are socialized more for dependence. One practical implication of this is when you're looking at who are the stakeholders when you're working with a family, it is very important you get the male buy-in, the father's buy-in in addressing the needs of the family in order to ensure that there's enough buy-in in the whole system to have change move forward. The other thing to consider is that when you have a very strong male hierarchical society, when the male is not present, when there is not a father that's present, quite often I have found that the boy, the oldest son, the boy, even if he's only 11, 12, 13, has an enormous amount of power within that family structure, more so than the USA culture would probably be comfortable giving them. And so you run in often to mothers who feel that they can't really speak with authority to their male children, even though the child is still a child, because of their maleness. And that creates a whole bunch of issues for us when we're working with families. Just looking at this same map, you look at male dominance, you look at the deeper red is the strong male dominance, and it goes up, the gradient goes up to um, the clear. And you will notice cultures, specifically the United States is pretty high up there, but if you look at Mexico right below it, you see it as a gradient higher than the US. It's also a gradient higher than, for example, where I was born in Argentina. And you notice in the middle of South America there are some countries that have very, very low male dominance. And what's interesting, that is attributed largely to the native population, that the group I was talking about, the Quechua and the Guarani is another indigenous group of people. And they have a more their women have a higher hierarchy than the males in their society. Another big thing is when you're looking at the culture is Latino culture tends to value contentment much higher than materialism. So, for example, they value experiences more likely than they value things. An example of this is if you look at how people spend money. Latino families often will spend what we would consider an inordinate amount of money on a party like a quinceañera, or on an experience like going to the movie theater. If we take children to the movies, my Latino families lots of times will give their children $20 to spend on treats and snacks because they value experience. At the same time, they may not spend the money on the new shoes or the new clothing because they have a less value in things. In Argentina, one of the ways this shows out is once you achieve middle class, one of the first things you do is you hire a maid or you hire a gardener, because and you do this way before you buy yourself a new house or a new car. And the reason is you are lessening you want somebody to lessen your workload in the home so you can value experiences with your family, the relationships. They value time, and they have a lower attachment to material things. One of the things that really drove my dad crazy was when he would loan things out, like loan books out to people in Latin America, and he would then go a couple weeks later and ask, where's my book? Can I have it back? And they'd say, oh, well, we loaned it to so-and-so. And so we'd go to them and like, oh no, we loaned it to so-and-so. So basically my dad could never find his books again after he loaned them out, because the attachment to material things is less strong. Interestingly, it shows in even the legal system. Where I grew up, you could be a burglar and rob a house and get caught, but it's more like a misdemeanor. But if you hurt somebody, then the penalty goes way, way up. In our country, because we value material things at such a high level, your criminal charges based on taking somebody's possessions are almost at the same consequential level as when you do personal harm to them. And we have all these senses of personal property, guarding our personal property, those types of things. Another thing to think about is the value that Latino culture puts on the past, on history, on its stories, on living with, for example, your ancestors in Dia de los Muertos, where you actually celebrate the death of your ancestors in a way that we don't in this country. In this country, what seems to take more of our focus is future planning. Think about the future, we plan for the future. In Latino culture, we tend to think about the past as much as the future. So with the time allowed, I've come to the end of the formal presentation. I want to leave you with a recommendation to, if you want to dig a little deeper into working in the culturally diverse settings. This is a textbook actually by Sue and Sue. Actually first intersected and worked with this textbook probably about 15 years ago, but they've continued to update it, and I found it to be a very, very helpful text. For what I'd like to do is, as we go to our breakout session, is I'd like to use that time to talk more specifically about the specific sort of struggles in working with in a multicultural setting, talk about more specific needs that especially the children have, and also talk a little bit more about the clinical implications of working with these value systems, the Latino value systems, as a guide to helping us make clinical decisions. So hopefully in this breakout session, there will be ability for us to have a give and take and get information back and forth, have a real dialogue about these things, and put some of what you've learned in practice. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you all soon in the breakout. Thank you.
The Kentucky Association for School Social Work would like to thank all of the 2020 sponsors for their contribution to the association in the field of social work. KASSW would like to take a moment to both recognize and thank them. Thank you to our gold sponsors: the University of Louisville Kent School of Social Work, Sun Behavioral Health. Thank you to our silver sponsors: WellCare, New Vista, and Ridge Behavioral Health. Thank you to our bronze sponsors: Peace Hospital. Thank you again to all of our sponsors. For information on how to obtain your CEU certificate, join us live for a Q&A with Mr. Andrew Olson. See the link below for access to the Zoom meeting.